So last time we looked at Kripke's explication of the description theory of names. This time we're going to look at Kripke's critique of that theory. So let's start with the first thesis. We're just going to go through the theses one at a time and see what Kripke says about each of them. So the first thesis says, to every name or designating expression X, there corresponds a cluster of properties, namely the family of those properties phi, such that A believes phi of X. And Kripke says that this is true, but not very interesting. Why isn't it very interesting? Well, all it says is this: any competent user of a name believes something or other about the referent. And Kripke thinks that seems pretty plausible. At any rate, since Kripke rejects the description theory of names by rejecting 2 to 6, this number 1 isn't so important for him. Now, I'm not sure he's right that thesis 1 is true. It seems to me that you can pick up a name and believe nothing at all about the individual, but still use the name to refer to that individual. But I'm not going to go through this here because it doesn't seem especially important to understanding Kripke. Okay, number 2. One of the properties, or some conjointly, are believed by A to pick out some individual uniquely. Now, Kripke is going to reject this thesis, and he's going to reject the rest of the theses. So here's an example. Green comes along and says, I wonder whether Feynman works at a university. And when Green thinks of Feynman, all Green thinks is this: Feynman is a famous physicist. So Green doesn't have any further beliefs about Feynman. Now, it's obvious that Green does not believe that being a famous physicist is unique to Richard Feynman. Like Green might also believe Einstein is a famous physicist, for example, and maybe Stephen Hawking, and so on and so forth. So Green's only belief about Feynman is that Feynman is a famous physicist, and Green certainly does not believe that this property, being a famous physicist, picks out Feynman uniquely. Nonetheless, Kripke's idea goes, Green can use the name Feynman successfully. Green is competent with the name and can use it to refer to Richard Feynman. And it follows that thesis 2 is false. So just walking through this again, Green does not believe that Feynman is the only famous physicist. That's the only description Green associates with Feynman. So Green doesn't believe that some of the properties that he associates with Feynman pick out some individual uniquely. Green uses Feynman to refer to Feynman. So it's false that if one can use a name to refer, then one of the properties or some conjointly are believed by that individual to pick out some individual uniquely. So thesis 2 is false. Now, here's another way to think about this. This is to emphasize the constraint about circularity. Suppose this person thinks, I wonder whether Einstein was American, and then thinks, I believe Einstein discovered the theory of relativity, but don't know much else about him, and I only know this of the theory of relativity. It was discovered by Einstein. According to Kripke, Green believes that Einstein uniquely discovered the theory of relativity, and that's all well and good, but Green knows only those theory only is that which Einstein discovered, so the only property that Green believes to pick out Einstein uniquely violate that circularity condition. Okay, this is important not just for this kind of example here, but also for examples like where, imagine Green tries to use Einstein and tries to refer to Einstein with it, and somebody says, well, who do you think Einstein is? And the only thing Green can say is the person named by the name Einstein. Well, if you allowed in that kind of description, then it would sort of trivialize these theses. Okay. Thesis 3, if most or a weighted most of those properties are satisfied by some object uniquely, then that object is the referent of that name. Now here's Kripke's example against this. Kripke says, I wonder whether Gödel was an American. And when you ask Green, who is Gödel? Green thinks, okay, I believe Gödel discovered the incompleteness theorem. So now condition 2 is satisfied because there's only one person who did that. And the circularity condition isn't a problem here because Green understands Gödel's incompleteness theorem fully. So you say, well, what's the incompleteness theorem? Green won't say it's what Gödel discovered. Green will give a full specification of the principle. Okay, so we're good on 2. We're good on the circularity condition. So what's the problem? According to Kripke, Green believes that Gödel uniquely discovered the incompleteness theorem, which has us, we're doing well so far. And Green knows the theorem, so we're good on the circularity. So is it still possible that 3 is false? Well, Kripke thinks it is, and he asks us to consider the following scenario. So here you have somebody who comes along and is ready to announce the brilliant discovery that no formal system can represent every truth of arithmetic completely and consistently. Now along comes someone who thinks, that's very interesting. That's the kind of thing that can make somebody famous. And suppose that maroon here is the person who was dubbed Gödel at birth and has been called Gödel ever since. And orange here is a person who was dubbed Schmidt at birth and has been called Schmidt ever since. And maroon thinks like, well, I have a good plan here to hopefully, make myself some money, get myself some fame, and plans to pass this off as his own. Maroon's plan works wonderfully, let's suppose. He passes off the theorem as his own and gets all the credit. No one ever knows much about Orange, except that Orange was found dead on the road one day. Maroon was dubbed Gödel at birth and has been called that since, and Orange was dubbed Schmidt at birth and has been called that since. Whom does our ordinary word Gödel refer to in this scenario? Well, intuitively, Kripke says, it clearly refers to this guy who was dubbed Gödel at birth and has been called that ever since. And it clearly does not refer to this guy who was dubbed Schmidt at birth and has been called Schmidt ever since. But thesis 3 says, if most or a weighted most of the properties that we associate with someone are satisfied by some individual, that individual is the referent of X. And for most of us who are competent users of the name Gödel, what we associate with the name is the person who proved this incompleteness theorem. So we would say this person satisfies that description, therefore this person is the referent of the name Gödel. But clearly that's wrong. So thesis 3 is wrong. Okay. So when one says, does Gödel work in a university? Is Gödel an American? And so on. One is talking about Orange according to thesis 3. And when one says Gödel proved the incompleteness theorem, what one says is true because Orange proved the incompleteness theorem and Gödel refers to Orange. And when one says Gödel stole the theorem and killed Schmidt, what one says is false because Gödel refers to Orange and Orange didn't kill himself and he didn't steal the theorem. But of course, that's all wrong. The point is 3 implies all of that, but it's all wrong. If you say Gödel killed Schmidt, what you say is true. If you say Gödel stole the theorem, what you say is true. And because those statements are true, 3 must be false because 3 implies that those statements are false. So here's Kripke. He says, no way. He thinks that Gödel refers to maroon, not orange. So when one says, does Gödel work in a university? Is Gödel American? I saw Gödel the other day, and so on. One is talking about maroon. And when one says Gödel proved the incompleteness theorem, what one says is false because Orange proved the incompleteness theorem, and Gödel doesn't refer to Orange. Gödel refers to maroon. And when one says Gödel stole the theorem and killed Schmidt, what one says is true because Gödel refers to maroon, who did steal the theorem. Okay, there's some passages here which are on the slides, which are posted. You can read them there. I'm not going to read through them here. You can pause this if you just want to read them here. Same thing. Okay. Now let's look at thesis 5, the statement, if X exists, and we skipped over 4 because 4 is just the uniqueness condition, and really the objection is the same. I did talk about the Jonah example in class, but if you want to read it here, you can pause it. Okay, thesis 5. The statement, if X exists, then X has most of the phi's, is known a priori by the speaker. Now, notice that, says Kripke, that even in a case where 3 and 4 happen to be true, a typical speaker hardly knows a priori that they are, as required by the theory. Now, what's going on here? And here's Kripke's idea. He says, look, I think it happens to be true that the description I associate with Gödel is the person who proved the incompleteness theorem, and that's in fact true. That is, that Gödel is the person who discovered the incompleteness theorem. So thesis 3 just happens to be true. That is, the description that Kripke associates with the name Gödel is uniquely satisfied by one person, and that person is the referent of the name Gödel. But Kripke says, I don't know a priori that it is. Why don't I know a priori that it is? Because I don't know a priori that this story we just looked at is false, right? So Kripke thinks this story is false and consequently thinks that it's true that Gödel proved the incompleteness theorem, but it's not a condition on his semantic competence that the story be true. To put it another way, even though the story, let's say, is as a matter of fact false, that is, this guy here really did prove the incompleteness theorem and did not steal it from this guy over here whom he murdered. Even though it is true that he discovered the incompleteness theorem, we don't know a priori that it's true because we can't say a priori that this story is false. To say that this story is false, we'd have to go out and look at the world and see that this guy never did kill this guy. And we'd maybe watch this guy doing the work and writing down the theorem and so on and so forth. Okay, so thesis 5 is false as well. And again, it's false even when theses 1 through 4 happen to hold in a particular case. Now thesis 6, this is now shifting from the sense fixes reference to the, and we can access senses a priori, to the idea that senses give the meaning of names. the statement, if X exists, then X has most of the phi's expresses a necessary truth. Kripke says this is false as well. Why is it false? Well, take all of the descriptions we associate with Aristotle, like taught Alexander the Great, wrote Nicomachean Ethics, wrote De Anima, wrote Metaphysics, studied with Plato, founded the Lyceum, created formal logic, lived in Greece, list them all out. It's still going to be true for any of those descriptions. Now, this won't hold for all descriptions as we discussed in class. Like if you have the description that gives an essential property, it won't hold. But for all of the descriptions that are likely to be associated with a name by kind of an ordinary competent user, it will hold. An individual can lack all of those properties and still be Aristotle. So suppose that, as a matter of fact, the person dubbed Aristotle at birth and whose activities predominantly led to our acquisition of Aristotle has all these features, but there's some other possible world where that individual lacks those features. When we're talking about that world, our name Aristotle refers to that individual who is the same individual as he is in this world, not to some other individual who did these things instead. And consequently, thesis 6 is false. Okay. So that's all I'm going to say about Kripke on the description theory of names. His idea is that there's these 6 theses. Thesis 1 he thinks is true but not interesting, and theses 2 through 6 he thinks are all false. So the thesis he thinks is radically misguided. And during class we also talked about the causal theory of names. We'll start off next time by continuing to talk about the causal theory of names, which is Kripke's sort of substitution for the description theory, although Kripke won't call it a theory. He says it's like a sort of picture, the causal picture. And then we'll move on to talking about descriptive theory of natural kind terms. Okay, we'll stop there.